What Donald Trump launched as a shock and awe tariff campaign, designed to bend Canada's will and force submission, has backfired spectacularly. Instead of collapsing, the Canadian economy adapted. Instead of retreating, Canadians united. And instead of Mark Carney retaliating with fire and fury, he answered with something far more powerful: restraint, strategy, and collective purpose.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
Trump believed that economic threats alone could drive Canada to its knees. He thought a 25% tariff would make Prime Minister Trudeau beg for exemptions and Mark Carney buckle under investor pressure. Instead, he watched his credibility implode in real time. Why? Because Carney didn't play Trump's game. He flipped the board entirely. The Buy Canadian movement, economic protest turned powerhouse. The most powerful weapon in Canada's arsenal wasn't steel or tariffs. It was people, and they spoke through their wallets. In grocery stores, families walked past American cereal and bought Canadian oats. In liquor stores, U.S. bourbons gathered dust while sales of Canadian whiskey spiked 400%. Maple syrup exports surged not only because of patriotism, but because Canadians decided they didn't need to rely on a trading partner who treated them like an enemy. What began as quiet frustration morphed into a national movement. Buy Canadian wasn't government mandated. It was people powered. Social media exploded with hashtags like #StandWithCanada and #SkipTheStates. Small businesses were suddenly the front line in a trade war, and Canadians showed up, spending with pride. Even border towns that used to thrive on cross-border shopping saw a shift. Shopping trips to Buffalo and Seattle were swapped for stays in Banff and Vancouver Island. What Trump did in one executive order, Carney reversed by inspiring a cultural realignment rooted in pride, trust, and shared identity. Mark Carney's calculated patience wins the long game. While Trump played checkers with an oil drum in each hand, Carney played chess with calm precision. He knew retaliating with escalating tariffs would validate Trump's narrative. So instead, he took the high road. He kept lines of communication open, quietly expanded trade talks with Europe and Asia, and held steady while U.S. markets wobbled under the pressure of Trump's unpredictability. Carney's genius wasn't in yelling louder. It was in refusing to yell at all. He stayed focused. He reinforced internal Canadian industries, especially those targeted by Trump's tariffs. Steelworkers were given long-term infrastructure contracts. Canadian agriculture received new export credits. Supply chains were reworked. Jobs were protected. Carney didn't panic. He pivoted. His message to Canadians? We'll take care of each other first. The rest will follow. And it did. Trump's weapon backfires. The cost of coercion. Let's talk brass tacks. Tariffs are taxes. Period. And Trump, the no new taxes guy, just slapped American consumers with the biggest hidden tax hike in decades. That 25% tariff on Canadian aluminum, it raised the cost of everything from beer cans to car parts. The auto industry alone reported $3.3 billion in increased annual costs. Assembly lines slowed. Jobs were lost, not in Ottawa, but in Ohio. And guess who got the blame? Trump. And the irony? It was self-inflicted. Because Trump never understood that trade deficits don't make America losing. They make America reliant. And when you're reliant on allies like Canada, treating them like enemies doesn't give you leverage. It gives you consequences. Carney style. Pancakes and patience over politics and power plays. Remember when Trump stormed out of G7 in Charlevoix, fuming about weak Trudeau? While the cameras captured his tantrum, Carney was in a Quebec community center flipping pancakes with retirees. And that moment, quiet Canadian human went viral. Not because Carney was trying to upstage Trump, but because it represented everything Trump wasn't: calm, kind, competent. While Trump played the strong man, Carney played the steward. And Canadians noticed, so did global investors. In the months following Trump's terror threats, Canadian markets saw an unexpected surge in capital inflows. Why? Because when you treat your allies with dignity and your economy with discipline, the world responds. Carney didn't need to bark threats. He just needed to be a safe place for business. And in Trump's economic hurricane, Canada became that safe haven. The myth of the deal maker shattered. Trump billed himself as the ultimate negotiator. But every time he sent an angry letter threatening more tariffs, Carney waited. He didn't blink. And slowly it became clear Trump had no plan, no exit strategy, just escalation. Meanwhile, Carney kept building. He convened quiet forums between business leaders and premiers. He created loan guarantees for exporters and pushed provinces to eliminate outdated regulations that slowed domestic trade. He built a Canada that didn't need Trump's America. Because while Trump banked on making Canada crawl back to the negotiating table, Carney simply created new tables, reclaiming Canadian identity through economic sovereignty. This trade war wasn't just about cars and steel. It was about who Canadians believe they are. For too long, economic dependence on the U.S. had become normalized, even accepted. But Trump woke something up. He triggered a national reckoning. Why do we rely so heavily on a neighbor who clearly doesn't respect us? Under Carney's guidance, that question turned into policy. Canada revisited its food sovereignty strategy. It invested in digital infrastructure so local businesses could compete globally. It created subsidies for Canadian tech and green innovation. Canadians didn't just want to buy Canadian because of fight. They wanted to do it because it felt right. It felt empowering. And suddenly, economic independence wasn't just a fiscal objective. It was an identity. Across the Atlantic and Pacific, diplomats and economists took notes. Carney's approach became a case study in global economic forums. His ability to absorb pressure without retaliating recklessly made him the anti-Trump, the statesman the world could trust. Canada began getting more trade overtures from Asia and Europe. Investors started asking, why not Toronto instead of why not Texas? Global manufacturers rerouted supply chains to avoid U.S. unpredictability. Trump might have dominated headlines, but Carney reshaped outcomes. Trump wanted a fight. He got a mirror, and in it, America saw the reflection of presidency built on ego and threats, unraveling under the weight of a neighbor who refused to stoop to its level. Mark Carney didn't raise his voice. He raised his country. He didn't shame Trump. He made him irrelevant. Because the most powerful defeat isn't through retaliation. It's through evolution. And that's exactly what Canada did. This isn't a story of war. It's a story of wisdom. Trump's tariffs were meant to break Canada. Instead, they built it. Canadians came together, not with flags and fire, but with purpose and pride. Carney didn't exploit division. He harnessed unity. And in doing so, he turned a crisis into an awakening. In a world of sound bites and standoffs, Carney proved that you don't need to scream to be strong. You just need a plan and the trust of your people. And now, long after the tariffs fade, one truth remains. Canada stood tall without firing a shot, and the world noticed. Trump came with thunder. Carney answered with resilience. And in the end, only one was left standing. The tremors of Trump's trade war didn't stop at Canada's border. They ricocheted across the world economy, shaking investor confidence and prompting nations to rethink their relationships with Washington. Suddenly, allies from Germany to South Korea began hedging their bets. Trade delegations multiplied. Not in D.C., but in Ottawa, Brussels, Tokyo, and Singapore. The question wasn't just, what is Trump going to do next? It was, how do we protect ourselves from American volatility? And there, standing in the diplomatic vacuum Trump created, was Mark Carney. He wasn't waving flags. He wasn't holding summits. He was having quiet conversations behind closed doors, crafting new frameworks, signing alternative trade pacts. Slowly but methodically, building a web of economic resilience that no single tweet could unravel. Canada's domestic economic transformation. While Trump bellowed about manufacturing and imposed tariffs that killed more jobs than they created, Carney helped rewire Canada's economy from the inside out. In just 18 months, regional supply chains were reconstructed to prioritize Canadian inputs. Provinces signed new procurement agreements. Interprovincial trade, long clawed by red tape, was cleared by Carney's pressure and persuasion. For the first time in decades, Canadian companies were selling more to each other than they were to the U.S. And it wasn't just economic policy. It was cultural momentum. Canadian innovation hubs in places like Montreal and Vancouver blossomed, receiving investment once earmarked for Silicon Valley. Farmers retooled their operations to meet European export standards. Even Canadian luxury brands, long overshadowed by American names, gained a newfound shine in the global marketplace. Why? Because being not American became an asset. Trump's fallacy, confusing volume for value. Here's the fundamental flaw in Trump's approach. He believed that size equals strength, that because America had a massive economy, it could dictate terms without consequence. But trade doesn't work that way. When you insult your partners, break agreements, and lash out with tariffs, those partners adapt. And when enough of them adapt, the power you thought you had, it dissolves. Canada was the proof, but it wasn't the only one. By mid-2025, a quiet exodus of global capital from the U.S. was underway. Multinationals began shifting production lines. Asian economies accelerated regional trade compacts. The EU floated digital trade standards, ones Canada helped shape. Trump had believed he could isolate Canada into submission, but he ended up isolating America instead. Mark Carney's global ascent. Back at home, Carney had already secured a status as a national figurehead, but abroad, he was becoming something more, a statesman. Global media dubbed him the quiet architect. International finance leaders called on him to advise on currency stabilization and post-dollar reserve strategies. Canada, long seen as a junior partner in North American trade, was now leading rooms that once belonged to Washington. His message was simple. In an era of political volatility, nations need alliances rooted in principles, not personalities. Stability, predictability, and integrity were no longer luxuries. They were prerequisites for prosperity. The world listened. Because Carney didn't just talk about trust, he embodied it. Canadian consumers, the unsung heroes of the revolt. Let's be clear, none of this happened in a vacuum. It wasn't just policy that carried Canada through, it was people. It was a cafe owner who swapped out her American supplier for a Nova Scotia roaster. The Toronto family that canceled their Disney trip and visited Jasper National Park instead. The university student who turned #BuyCanadian into a TikTok movement. The farmer who held out, refused to sell at loss, and got a government-backed export deal to India. This wasn't just economic behavior. It was political participation. It was national expression. Canada's consumer base acted not out of hostility, but out of resolve, out of clarity. They knew what was at stake. They weren't going to let a foreign bully dictate their future. And with every purchase, they made their voices heard. Trump's legacy, a self-inflicted wound on American influence. While Carney emerged from the crisis stronger, Trump left behind a scorched landscape of frayed alliances, broken deals, and skyrocketing costs. American farmers, once promised better deals, were drowning in surplus and debt. Midwestern factories, told they'd be protected, watched as automation and supply chain gaps killed production lines. The consumer, promised cheaper goods and national glory, was met with price hikes, empty shelves, and uncertainty. And America's most powerful export, its credibility, was gone. When a country uses trade as a threat, when its leader breaks promises and insults allies, the world adapts. But more importantly, it remembers. Carney knew this. That's why he played for trust instead of applause. The trade war's unlikely winner, a more united Canada. Perhaps the greatest irony? The trade war that was supposed to divide Canada actually united it. In Parliament, partisan lines blurred as leaders across the spectrum backed Carney's calm approach. Premiers from Alberta to Quebec stood shoulder to shoulder, recognizing the stakes were bigger than politics. Even skeptical voices in the business community came around. Tariffs had hurt, yes, but Carney's policies had stabilized. His vision, diversified trade, internal reform, and consumer-driven resilience was working, and Canadians felt it. For the first time in a generation, national identity wasn't just about culture or hockey. It was about economic pride, a masterclass in modern leadership. Mark Carney didn't win with charisma or slogans. He won with clarity, consistency, and quiet execution. He showed that in the era of bluster and strongman politics, there's still power in being thoughtful, still strength in being strategic, still value in choosing dignity over drama. His leadership during the trade conflict is now studied, not just in Canada, but around the world, not because it was flashy, but because it worked. Conclusion: who controls the future? Trump believed power came from loud threats and unilateral moves. Carney believed it came from mutual respect, internal strength, and trust. History has answered. Canada didn't win through force. It won through faith. Faith in its people, in its systems, and in a new way forward. And Trump? He didn't lose because someone beat him in the ring. He lost because Carney never stepped into it. He built a new arena instead. One where Canada makes the rules, trades on its own terms, and moves forward unshaken. So who controls the future? Not the one who screams the loudest. The one who listens, builds, and lasts. And Mark Carney, quietly, methodically, patriotically, has built something that's not only lasting, it's leading. What began as a trade dispute ended up becoming a global case study in how to outmaneuver economic aggression without firing a single retaliatory shot. Canada didn't just weather Trump's storm. It transformed its entire economic architecture under pressure, and in the process, became a blueprint for nations caught in the crossfire of volatile leadership. Mark Carney's strategy wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. He took a crisis and turned it into an opportunity. And in doing so, he didn't just rescue Canada from a devastating trade war. He rewrote the rules of modern economic diplomacy. Carneyism, the new economic doctrine. Carneyism, yes, that's what economists have started calling it, is rooted in 4 principles. Strategic patience. Never escalate chaos. Let the aggressor burn out. Internal resilience. Strengthen what's inside your own borders first. Economic trust building. Trade is not a weapon. It's a contract of credibility. Grassroots nationalism. If your people believe in your economy, no tariff can touch you. These aren't just buzzwords. They're the pillars that held up Canada's economy during the ugliest trade war in modern North American history. And as Trump flailed from threat to threat, screaming about deficits while inflating them, Carney quietly built a doctrine that the EU, Japan, India, and even African trade blocs began to study. Because while America collapsed under the weight of its own economic narcissism, Canada rose, not with force, but with discipline. Canada's global position, from junior partner to power broker. For decades, Canada's global role was defined by proximity to the U.S. It was a sidekick, the quieter sibling, the diplomatic helper. But that dynamic shattered under Trump. Once the U.S. turned inward, other nations looked north. And what they saw was stability, reliability, a leader who knew how to build trust in volatile markets. Carney didn't chase attention, but he got it anyway, from finance ministers in Europe, central bankers in South America, and even tech CEOs in Silicon Valley looking for safer investment climates. Suddenly, Canada wasn't a passenger on the American trade bus. It was driving its own vehicle, charting a new course with like-minded allies. U.S. chaos, the economic wound that keeps bleeding. Meanwhile, Trump's America was in freefall. The tariff threats backfired. The consumer price index exploded. Farmers faced bankruptcy at record rates. Small-town manufacturing, once promised a revival, flatlined under the weight of supply chain disruptions and retaliatory tariffs. And worst of all, no one wanted to deal with the U.S. anymore. Diplomats dreaded trade summits. Corporations relocated. Even longtime allies like Germany and the U.K. began hedging their supply lines away from American ports. Trump's legacy? Turning the world's most powerful economy into a cautionary tale. Trump wanted to humiliate Canada. Instead, he activated it. He wanted to bully the North. Instead, he built its backbone. He wanted to dominate the trade conversation. Instead, he silenced himself with noise so deafening, no one listens anymore. Carney didn't clap back. He didn't grandstand. He just did the work. And now, the global economy looks more like the vision he quietly championed. and less like the reality Trump tried to force. The war is over. The scoreboard is clear. Carney won. Canada rose. And Trump? He kneels, not to Carney, but to consequences.